Hello, my name is Darren Griffiths. I'm an audit manager within the NHS performance audit team of Audit Wales, and I'm joined today by Pam Wenger, who is the Director of Corporate Governance at Swansea Bay University Health Board and also Chair of the All Wales Board Secretaries Network. Thank you for joining me, Pam.
Thank you, Darren. Hello, my name is Pam Wenger. I'm the Director of Corporate Governance for Swansea Bay Health Board. It's a real privilege to be able to talk to Darren today about governance during the pandemic. And as Darren has said, I'm also the Chair of the All Wales Board Secretary peer group.
Thanks, Pam. So today we want to talk about how health bodies in Wales governed during the COVID-19 pandemic. We recently published a report called Doing It Differently, Doing It Right. And in that report, we describe how NHS bodies in Wales adapted their governance arrangements during the pandemic to respond to the unprecedented challenges and pressures you faced as NHS organisations during the pandemic. And in our report, we found that all of the NHS bodies operated effectively with a sense of urgency and a common purpose to adopt lean and agile ways of working and achieve rapid transformation, whilst also maintaining a clear focus on core areas of business and governance. So today's conversation is kind of building on the work and hearing, giving you the opportunity to share your experiences and reflections of being a Director of Corporate Governance during these unprecedented and challenging times, and also sharing some of the learning you've observed from cooperating with your colleagues across Wales. So we've got a couple of questions we'd like to run through today, Pam, if that's okay. So in what way has the role of the Board Secretary changed during the pandemic?
I think it's changed for a number of reasons, I would say. Often the role of the Board Secretary, Director of Corporate Governance is one of meaning to support and advise the board in terms of good governance. But there's so much more to that than the role that we do. We do a lot of work behind the scenes to ensure that the board is able to discharge its functions in an effective and appropriate way. And through the pandemic, certainly my experience and my colleagues' experiences have been, as the principal governance advisor for the organisation, it's never been more important to have our roles in place. And I think it's been a real positive change for us as board secretaries, as being a critical point in advising the boards through our chairs and chief executives to keep the organisation safe and discharge its functions whilst responding to the pandemic. So certainly from my perspective, and I'm sure my colleagues' perspective, it's been a positive change. People understanding the importance of good governance as an enabler for decision making, as opposed to a barrier. And it's a great opportunity for us now to reflect on the role as chief governance advisors for the organisation as we move forward in terms of our learning and next stages of the pandemic and taking things forward.
That's great. Thanks, Pam. So in your view, what have been the main challenges you and your fellow board secretaries have faced during the pandemic? And how have you overcome these challenges, kind of individually and collectively as a group?
So I think it's been an extremely challenging period for every member of staff that's worked in the NHS and beyond. The way in which we had to adapt our decision making whilst keeping the organisation safe was often very challenging because of the pace in which we needed to make those decisions. As organisations and my reflections, we often had to step outside of our traditional roles and all run towards supporting the pandemic because it was all hands to the pump. So it's been very challenging for us as board secretaries as well as NHS boards. But I think we took a number of steps during the very early stages of the pandemic, which I think set us in good stead, NHS Wales. So we've always had a very collaborative way of working as board secretaries, but I would say through the pandemic we have strengthened our ways and approaches of working. And at a very early stage in March, we developed a set of governance principles by which we would all work to in terms of our decision making. And we agreed those collectively as a group of board secretaries and suggested those to Welsh Government. The setting of those principles actually were critical for the way in which we were enabled to change our governance framework and decision making. So for me, that was critical, and that was a once for Wales approach, and I think that has built upon this success. And I think, you know, looking at your report, that comes across in your report. I think the other important area for me is the pace in which we all had to adapt to virtual working. As board secretaries, no different to any other group of individuals, we met regularly, often on a weekly basis, to share what's going on in each other's organisation, to learn practices and then any other sort of area that pitfalls some organisations were facing. So we were sharing the issues, we were offering solutions and working collaboratively, and the use of virtual working has enabled that. And I think the other point, as a group of board secretaries, we were there as support. It's been a really challenging time for us all personally as well as professionally. We've all got we're all facing this pandemic as individuals, and sometimes we all be at different stages in terms of emotions and challenges, and the ability to pick up a phone or have a Teams meeting with a colleague, share what you're going through, has been a tremendous support. So I would say it's been really challenging, but actually it's been a real privilege to have held these positions, the most extraordinary learning experience of my career. I would take a lot from it, but what I will take most from it is actually the support I've had from my colleagues, my friends and family. So we're all in it together.
That's great. Thanks, Pam. So it sounds like you've been able to identify a number of opportunities to come from the pandemic. So you've listed some, of the kind of the key achievements you and your colleagues were able to accomplish during the pandemic. Were there any other achievements you were able to accomplish during the pandemic?
There were many. So I think one of the most important achievements, so as boards, we're accountable to the public in terms of our transparency and openness. All of a sudden, we were faced with that we couldn't hold our board meetings in public. Because of the pandemic. We couldn't hold our committee meetings and other corporate meetings as we would have normally done. So collectively, we reviewed our board schedules in terms of the critical business meetings that we needed to have to keep to make appropriate decision makings and stand down some committee meetings that weren't essential. We still maintained our audit committee and quality and safety committees, as well as our board meetings. So I think the approach and the sharing of different approaches across NHS Wales was really important, and we were able to share what each organisations were doing. Because of the pandemic and the restrictions in terms of physical distancing and in public spaces, we needed to consider the way in which we were able to hold our board meetings. So in the very early stages, some organisations I can recall were using audio calls for their first board meetings, and then some organisations were much further ahead and then were using video calls through Teams or Zoom. And actually, some organisations are even further ahead, and they were live streaming through from Zoom to Facebook and actually to YouTube. So for me, the pace in which we were able to move from audio calls, board meetings, to live streaming via these mediums was significant, and probably you know, if we were looking to do that in a normal situation, that might take a number of months to get us ready for that. So that was a significant achievement, certainly in terms of the way in which we conducted our business. And actually the way, because some of the health boards and trusts were further ahead because they've done some live streaming previously. They were a bit further ahead in terms of how they've done it and how they interacted with the wider public. So we were able to share what went well, what to avoid, how do we develop some etiquette in terms of conducting our public meetings. So we had different organisations at different stages, and actually we were able to learn and reflect on those and what to avoid. So then we can then adapt those in terms of our local organisation. So that was one of the key achievements, I would say. And often we'll see now people being able to interact and engage with our board meetings in a way they never ever thought was possible. And at a time when we're responding to the pandemic, the openness and transparency is really critical in terms of our public accountability.
That's great. So you set out there, you know, a number of quite key positive changes that have been brought about by the pandemic. Are there any other positive changes you feel which have been brought about to the pandemic in terms of the way NHS bodies are governed?
Yes, so I think that there are many changes, and each organisation will have done something slightly different to meet their needs of their board. You know, so certainly some of the common themes I would say have been picked up has been about regular briefings with our independent members. So chairs meeting on a weekly, you know, sometimes more frequently basis throughout the pandemic with our independent members, sometimes involving some of the executives, sometimes not. But that was that for me has been a real positive mechanism to engage the wider independent members of the board in terms of what's going on because of the pace of change. So they were kept informed and engaged at a very almost live basis through weekly briefings or other frequencies, as well as other communication mechanisms. So that was really positive. And certainly my experience has been that the independent members have really appreciated that mechanism. And we're looking at different ways of providing assurance on the delivery of our objectives in terms of more informal mechanisms. So for me, you know, that's one of the key improvements that, you know, we wouldn't want to take a step back at, because this challenge and scrutiny at board meetings then is much more mature because the independent members, for example, are much more engaged and informed. So that's a real one example about let's learn from that. Let's make our decision making more agile to make sure the board is focusing on what the board needs to be focusing on. I think there's a couple of other components. We all had to step into different roles during the pandemic, and I felt the whole boards were really supportive of the executive teams and the pressures that they were under. So they're being respectful in terms of the demands on the organisation. But, you know, as you can see through your report and other governance reports we've had, actually we've had good decision making and good governance during the pandemic, and that's fantastic experience and learning. So, you know, there's something around roles, responsibilities, and how we can discharge some of the governance arrangements there. And then another aspect which I think is quite important, that we stepped up our board meetings to certainly from my organisation's perspective, to monthly board meetings at the very height of the first wave. They were much more shorter and focused, focusing on the key matters in terms of COVID and decision making. So often board and committee meetings can be very, very long, and actually we need to make sure as we learn from the decision making through COVID that we have appropriately timely committee and board meetings that aren't overly long but are strategic, focused in nature. So certainly there's some opportunities in terms of some of that learning to make sure we don't simply step back to the old way of working, because that's how we always did it before. So those are, there are many others, but those are some of the key achievements from my perspective.
That's great. Thanks, Pam. Which of those changes do you think should be retained and embedded in the post-pandemic world? So of those key changes you've described, which ones do you think, you would really like to retain and embed further and within your kind of governance structures and arrangements and processes, and why?
So I would like to retain virtual meetings, but more of a hybrid approach, because I think virtual meetings are fine for a point, but actually it doesn't take away from the importance of the engagement with the wider board when we're able to. So I think, but I would like to continue in terms of how we make these board meetings accessible and available to the wider general public, and I'm sure that that's the same with all organisations. So that is definitely one for me. We've made the jump, as uncomfortable sometimes as it may be, to be live streamed on a board meeting. We just need to adapt that, learn from how we've done it, and go forward. So that's one definitely for me. The other one actually, even though I talked about we might have a hybrid approach in terms of public board meetings, our committee meetings have been really effective virtually, and I wouldn't want to go back to that. So it works better for the independent members, it works better for the board, it's much more accessible for people that need to participate in that. So very much keeping to our committee arrangements with shorter meetings, but focusing on the key matters. And also just thinking about some of the other ways in which the board can get assurance in terms of its objectives, which doesn't always need to be through a formal committee or a formal paper. There are other ways to get assurance, and enabling the independent members to discharge their scrutiny, hold it to account role in different ways. And it will be different for different organisations, but there are, I think, much better ways that in which we can consider the agile decision making and good governance in terms of that. And then the other bit, probably some organisations have used it as an opportunity to review their committee structures in line with standing orders, to make them much more slimline, streamlined, focusing on the key things, which sort of links back to the previous area. So I think that's a great opportunity for us all now to reflect on that. I think part of the challenge is we often have, I suppose, issues that we need to take through our boards. But actually, there's different ways in which the board can discharge those functions. So I think we just need to be challenging some of those going forward.
Great, wonderful, thanks, Pam. So what could other public sector bodies learn from the experiences of NHS bodies of governing during the pandemic?
I think for us in Wales, we're small. We like to work collaboratively. I think we work really well in partnership. What a fantastic opportunity that we've had, that we were meeting collectively on a very regular basis to talk about common approaches to governance. So I suppose in terms of the learning is how we work together across boundaries, but to come up with a common set of principles in terms of discharging governance. So I think a once for Wales approach. So that's definitely some learning, and in terms of success, if we hadn't done that at the start, I don't think we would have been successful in terms, we could have had very different approaches in terms of governance across Wales. So very much about the engagement across Wales, the support that we've had through our chairs and Welsh Government and other colleagues, but also just thinking about that cooperation, collaboration, and being there as a support for each other. So for me, it's all about partnership work, and we're all here to achieve the same goal, and we're all pulling in the same direction for the benefit of the population that we serve. And I think that's what the pandemic has brought for us. We want to do the best that we can. So very much collaboration, partnerships, and just peer support has been really appreciated.
Wonderful, that's great, thanks. And before we finish, do you have any final thoughts or reflections you'd like to share with us?
Just a couple, if I may. So
of course.
For me, it was a really challenging time at the start of the pandemic. The balance between appropriate decision making, as well as it working in an emergency to respond to the pandemic, puts the board secretary right out of their comfort zone, because of the pace in which decision needed to be made, the amount of information that was coming from lots of different sources to keep a handle on that, the ability to work really closely with the chair, which was critical in my from my perspective, just made it quite scary, if I'm honest, to make sure that I was doing the best I could do to discharge my responsibilities and my accountabilities through to the board. Whilst at the same time, the personal dilemmas we were all facing, we were all part of, the pandemic, our friends, our family, responding to some of that. So it was really, really difficult. But actually the support of my colleagues, my friends, my family, my chair, my chief exec, the whole board, and actually, our chair of our audit committee has enabled, I suppose, me to come through that and reflect. Actually, we did a good job in the circumstances that we had, and actually, we probably did better in some areas that we just need to take some of that learning forward. So I think just that recognition, we've all had a really difficult time, and trying to discharge our corporate responsibilities to the board as well as personal responsibilities has been really difficult. And I think the other thing I just wanted to note, really, the support that we've had through Audit Wales, through our other regulators, Health Inspectorate Wales, the approach that you've taken to be pragmatic and understand the pressures organisations are going through, but at the same time discharging your responsibilities has been really appreciated by myself and colleagues, because once you're in it and going through it, that's really, really, really challenging and difficult, and we almost didn't have that ever thing in the background chasing us into the audit. So I just, I think that's been really a welcomed approach, and I'm sure some of the regulators like ourselves are reflecting on how you've managed to discharge your responsibilities in a virtual world, and you probably would never go back. So I do think, it's wider than we're part of a wider system, and we couldn't do it without others. So and just, I suppose, just finally, we've got a fantastic group of board secretaries in Wales. It's a really privileged position to be in, and we wouldn't be where we are without each other's support. So I just think that is just important to note for the record.
That's great. Well, thanks very much, Pam. I think that's a good place to finish our interview today. Really grateful to you for your time today and for sharing your experiences and your reflections in such an open and honest way. I think a lot of people within the sector and other sectors in Wales will appreciate hearing your experiences and learning from what they've heard today, hopefully. So once again, thanks very much for your time, and we'll see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.